Last time we talked about the huge amount of work that went into wash days. Now we hear how Julia preserved food for the family, kept the home running, and even found clever ways to make daily chores easier. We continue with Chapter 8, She Can. The Flat Rock house only had 3 rooms: kitchen, living room, and bedroom. Alex added a sun porch to serve as a room for Lucille. There was a large 2-car garage behind the house, also built-in lean-to shed to accommodate tools and other things, and a root cellar to store vegetables for the winter. With no indoor toilet facilities, a 2-hole outhouse stood behind the garage. The 3 acres were planted to orchard and grapevines and a large vegetable garden. Further behind the garage was a large chicken coop and rabbit hutches, and then an arbor large enough to serve as a carport, which was eventually covered by grapevines. A pig was raised to be butchered in the fall. The little house was heated in winter by 2 coal or wood-burning stoves, the kitchen stove all year round, and an ornate stove in the living room to heat the rest of the house in winter. This latter stove had a glass window in front of the firebox so that it produced a yellow glow as the coal or wood burned, and a dull red glow when the stove was banked for the night. These 2 stoves created a lot of work for the boys. First, chopping wood and bringing in coal, and then keeping the fires going and removing the ashes and clinkers that would appear on the grate when the coal was burned. Also, there was lots of dirt, black, sooty dirt and dust that settled on everything and required a great deal of cleaning on Julia's part to keep things clean. The air would be filled with dust motes, which would be illuminated by the sun streaming through the windows of the sun porch. Fascinating to watch, of course, but the family breathed this air, and no one in those days was concerned about air pollution. Several acres of woods were nearby and would be visited periodically by Hungarian friends from the city to search for mushrooms. These visits would amount to quite enjoyable parties and were well rewarded, since several varieties of edible mushrooms were to be found, and the skill of the old country enabled them to pick out only those that were good to eat. Julia was quite adept at this and put up dozens of jars for later use. Canning was an art practiced by housewives everywhere, but out in the country, where really fresh fruits and vegetables were readily available, it was developed into a fine art indeed. The garden produced a quantity of foodstuffs far beyond what could be eaten fresh, so the surplus was preserved for use after the growing season was over and all through the winter. Corn, tomatoes, beans, peas, and fruits from the orchard were canned in vast quantities. Alex loved pickled hot peppers, which were put up whole in quart jars that had been sterilized in boiling water. The acid foods, such as tomatoes, were easy to preserve, but the non-acid foods like corn had to be done very carefully to avoid spoilage and possibly deadly food poisoning. The food was not only put boiling hot into the sterilized jars, but then they were covered loosely with their lids and then covered with boiling water and cooked for an additional 20 minutes, after which the lids were securely fastened, allowing the contents to cool and creating a vacuum as the steam condenses. All of this took enormous amounts of hard work by Julia and the children, as they were able to help. The food had to be picked, washed, peeled, and prepared for the jars. The jars had to be retrieved from the cellar space under part of the house and washed, rinsed, and sterilized. Even the lids had to be boiled. Early jars had glass lids held in place with wire bail and sealed with a rubber ring. Another early lid was a threaded zinc lid, which had a porcelain insert and was sealed by a separate rubber ring. The mason jars had metal lids with a rubber seal attached, which were held in place with a screwed-on ring. The ring could be removed and reused the same season after the jar cooled and the vacuum was holding the lid in place. Peaches and pears were canned by the bushel. This would be an all-day affair. The peaches were peeled by dipping into boiling water, then the skin would slip right off. Next, they were halved and pitted, then packed in neat layers, pit side down, in sterilized jars. This was called the cold pack method, which was suitable for the acidic fruits and vegetables. The fruit was then covered with a heavy syrup made by boiling 4½ cups of sugar in a 6½ cups of water. Then the jars were loosely sealed and put onto a rack which held 7-quart jars. This was then immersed into a special canning kettle, especially sized to fit the rack. Then they were covered with water, heated to boiling, and boiled rapidly for 30 minutes. The rack had a pair of handles which enabled the 7 quarts to be removed from the water safely. The lids were tightened and allowed to cool out of any draft, lest the jars could crack. Sauerkraut has a German name and the reputation of being a German dish, but it represents a method of preserving cabbage that is common to almost all ethnic cultures. Juliana's family had made it in Hungary, and Julia made it in America. Every family had a cabbage cutter, which was a board often placed across the opening between 2 chairs and fitted with a knife positioned at an angle over a slot. The cabbage head was passed over the knife, and the shredded cabbage slices would fall into a large crock. When full, the kraut was covered with a strong brine, salt solution. A plate would be inverted in the liquid and a stone or a brick placed on the plate to keep the cabbage submerged. The whole thing was then set out in the summer sun. 86 degrees is needed to provide proper fermentation. The salt drew the moisture and the natural sugars out of the cabbage, and the resulting liquid would ferment to make a preservative acid bath. The crock would be placed in the cool basement, and after 2 to 6 weeks it would be ready to eat. However, it would keep almost indefinitely and would provide nourishment throughout the whole winter. Berries and peaches, which were too ripe to can well, were made into jellies or jam. This was another art which the 19th and early 20th century housewife excelled. It required lots of sugar and some fruits. Some fruits required supplemental pectin to make them gel. The product was poured boiling hot into jelly glasses and sealed with a topping about 1/4 inch thick with melted paraffin. The result was a wonderful treat on thick slices of home-baked bread coated with butter. It's making my mouth water. Cherries were canned without their pits. Julia showed the children how to remove them with the rounded part of a paper clip. An automatic cherry pitter had been invented, but Julia didn't have one. So in June, when cherries, sour pie, and sweet black were ripe, they would have cherry pitting parties. They were cold packed in medium syrup and boiled for 25 minutes. When cool, the jars were stored on the high shelves of the root cellar. Extra jars were kept in the cellar under the house, where Alex had crawled in on his hands and knees and installed shelves for Julia's canned foods. A big day in the life of the family was when they purchased an icebox. Made of beautiful oak and provided with sparkling nickel-plated heavy brass hinges and latches, this appliance was a thing of real beauty. It held a 50-pound block of ice under a door at the top, and the food was kept in a compartment below. The water from the melting ice drained out the bottom into a pan which had to be emptied every day, or the water would overflow onto the kitchen floor. One of the boys drilled a hole in the floor and installed a hose so the water would run out into the yard. The ice had to be brought in from town, but in winter, food was kept in the root cellar, which was cold but not freezing. Canning and fruit cellars and an icebox. Canning, root cellars, and even a clever fix for the icebox showed how resilient they were. Canning, root cellars, even a fix for the icebox showed how resourceful they were. Thank you for listening. I will continue chapter 9 soon. And if you'd like to catch up, all the chapters are saved in a playlist called My Grandmother's Life.